do you have a prediction about how and when this war will end?
The worst case scenario would be that this war continues for months and years without a clear front line. So we would have a switching front line, have fightings taking place between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army. We see this David against Goliath fight with David perhaps winning.
Hello everyone, welcome to Phi-Sci. Joining me today is Liana Fix. Liana is a historian and political scientist with expertise in Eastern Europe, and she's currently the program director in the International Affairs Department at Körber Foundation. Liana has written widely on matters relating to Eastern Europe, and our discussion today is going to focus on a series of articles published in Foreign Affairs that are articulating various possible scenarios for the future of the Russian war in Ukraine. Liana, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for the invitation.
These 4 articles in Foreign Affairs were really interesting. I learned a lot from them. Thank you for writing them. Can we start with the question of what would a Russian victory in Ukraine look like, and what would the consequences of a Russian victory be?
Yeah, let me perhaps add that these articles are not only my brainchild, but also the ones of my colleague, Professor Michael Kimmich, who's also a fellow at the German Marshall Fund. And we worked on these articles together in the last month, since it became clear that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is actually going to take place. And our first idea was the first article that we wrote, What if Russia wins? Was published even before the war, because we thought it is necessary to think the unthinkable through and to think through the worst case scenarios. And the worst case scenario that we thought at that time would be possible is a Russian occupation of Ukraine, that Russia would be able to overrun Ukraine, that within a couple of days or weeks, Russia would win militarily and perhaps even achieve a change of government and take control of the capital of the eastern part of Ukraine, if perhaps even of the western part of Ukraine. So that was our first working assumption. I think it was also shared by military analysts, but this has quickly changed in light of Ukraine's resistance. And I think a Russian victory right now would look very different. A Russian victory now, I would define it as a agreement between Ukraine and Russia that is very much on Russian terms. So an agreement that would, for instance, demand from Ukraine a demilitarization, which could not only mean that Ukraine would not join NATO, which is a compromise President Zelensky already alluded to, but would mean that Ukraine loses its army is downsized, and that it loses control over major parts of its territory. I think that we would have to consider such a scenario, a Russian victory. The alternative, if there's no agreement, would be that Russia manages to stay in large parts of eastern Ukraine and perhaps also large parts of southern Ukraine, and can then from this position attack Ukraine again and again to finish the business that they've started. So a victory now looks very different from a victory in the first days of the war. And even the last scenario that I described could also be described as a stalemate rather than a Russian victory.
That possible scenario of a stalemate or a kind of long-term conflict where there's sort of no clear victor emerging, say, over the next few months, what would the nature of that conflict itself look like, and what would be the broader ramifications for, security in Europe and elsewhere?
The worst case scenario would be that this war continues for months and years without a clear front line. So we would have a switching front line, we would have fightings taking place between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army, but neither side is able to win significant gains that might then lead to negotiations and bring sort of pushback, and Ukraine would not be able to push back Russia behind the February 24 lines. That would be the worst case for the months and years to come, and that very much depends on the military support that Ukraine gets from the West, but it also depends on the pressure on Russia, especially when it comes to oil and gas sanctions. But this scenario would also mean on a global scale that food prices would go up, that we could see as a consequence instability in the Middle East and in Africa. But it would also mean that the political architecture, sort of the global political architecture would change. We already see now that countries of the global south accuse the West or Western countries of double standards in their reaction to Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. We could see those countries, for instance, India, emerging as an alternative to Russia, and the conflict and the war being very much a Western Russia conflict rather than a global response to Russia's aggression. The other consequence would be obviously an economic recession, especially in Europe, when it comes to oil and gas sanctions. And I mean, the worst case would be for Ukraine, that remains a war zone for months and years, and which would lead to further refugees and to a depopulation of Ukraine.
The prospects of a clear Russian victory have changed a lot, of course, and this has been something that's been sort of surprising and inspiring, if you will. The Ukrainian military has resisted with force, and so that raises the question, is a Ukrainian victory possible? In one of your foreign affairs articles, you claim that in this war there can't be a winner, but couldn't Ukraine emerge as victorious, and what would that look like?
I think we have to be careful not to sort of become too war optimistic, because this is a mistake that Moscow has done before they started the war, that they've been too optimistic about the outcome of the war, by which I definitely don't want to sound defeatist and to say that Ukraine is not making remarkable, is putting up a remarkable fight. But a scenario where Russia would be driven out from Crimea or the Donbass parts which they occupied before, if that is the scenario which is defined as victory, it does seem unlikely, because those are territories that Russia would not give up at almost any price, we have to fear. So a Ukrainian victory, from my perspective, would be getting close to the lines of February 24, as close as possible, and then negotiating with the Russian side on Ukrainian terms, and on better terms than Russia is offering now, combined with security guarantees by the West, a very unclear concept at the moment. Western states, including Germany, have suggested that they will provide security guarantees, but it's entirely unclear if these guarantees will be Article 5-like guarantees, and if they're not, if they're below Article 5, if any guarantee below Article 5 will be enough to deter Russia from another attack. So this component, the security guarantees, February, a front line close to February 24, that would be a Ukrainian victory from my perspective.
Russian aggression in Ukraine has in many ways been absolutely brutal towards civilian populations, to infrastructure. In other respects, it's been restrained. I mean, with respect to the actual force available to the Russian military. And so could you speculate for a moment about why that is? We're in the context of thinking about a potential Ukrainian victory. I mean, obviously, one might wonder, how on earth could there be a Ukrainian victory given the massive force available to be deployed by the Russian military?
I think there's several factors that have been identified in the last weeks that contribute to this, what you call sort of the constraint of the Russian army. I mean, the first factor is very obvious, the moral of the Russian army and the soldiers fighting there. And I speak about sort of the normal army and soldiers, rather not the Chechen fighters or the mercenaries. it's just very low compared to Ukraine's mole. The other part is that the war has been basically organized like the Crimea military operation. And I'm not repeating the Russian word for military operation. It is a war, but it was not prepared like a war. It was prepared like a small operation with only a limited group of people involved in planning. And according to some reports, even those middle range officers in the army receiving quite late information about what's actually going to happen. So that's the second argument why the Russian army is constrained. And then the third argument is also that the modernization of the Russian army, and Russia has invested in the modernization of its army since 2008, since the war in Ukraine, that does not replace experience. So especially fighting different armed forces fighting together, communication lines have been a major problem throughout this war. So the experience that Russia got from Syria is a very different experience than the one they now have in Ukraine. In Syria, it was basically from the air. Now in Ukraine, they are on the ground, and we see how they now try to learn from the mistakes that they've done at the beginning of the campaign. But it's a comparably poor performance that we see there. And then perhaps the last point is also, to some extent, it relates to MOL, is also what kind of support does the army receive? We've seen that Russia has launched this PR campaign about the Z logo to boost public support for the army. But it is a difference if you're attacked or if you're attacking. And this feeling of going into war for defending your homeland, although Russian propaganda tries to portray it that way as a preemptive war before Russia would have been attacked, it does not transport to the armed forces. And those are just a couple of reasons why we see this David against Goliath fight, with David perhaps winning.
Right. Okay, so those are some considerations that explain Russia's inability to gain much by way of territorial conquest thus far. I'm wondering also about restraint in their actual use of force. So we haven't seen much large-scale aerial bombardment, although of course there's been excessive use of rockets and artillery on urban infrastructure, but thus far no systematic campaigns of aerial bombardment, no use of very large bombs. Of course, we haven't seen any use of tactical nuclear weapons yet. So there is this huge amount of Russian military force ready to be deployed that hasn't yet been deployed. What do you make of that?
What you just mentioned, sort of the aerial bombings, especially at the beginning of the war, this is something which is assessed by military analysts basically as a mistake and as a lack of discipline. That every reasonable war plan would have suggested to continue with aerial bombardments to target all crucial sites before you move in with land forces. It also shows to what extent Russia has and Russia's army has underestimated Ukrainian forces, so that they didn't think it was necessary to do the proper discipline, the proper protocol, and the proper tactics how to continue this war. And I think that's perhaps one of the reasons, and it also relates to the question, how well do they actually know Ukraine in Moscow? I mean, there has been no Ukraine expertise whatsoever, because Ukraine was never considered to be a country that you need expertise on. When were key figures of the Kremlin in Ukraine, and not only for quick negotiations in Minsk or other capitals? And this sort of lack of deep knowledge, not only of Ukrainian society, but also sort of political structures in Ukraine has certainly contributed to this huge misunderstanding on the Russian side.
Okay, let's talk about Germany for a moment. Germany has held, a particularly distinctive place in the current conflict with respect to, broader issues about sanctions and military supplies. Can you comment on this? So what has been and what now is the German policy stance on weapon supplies and sanctions?
Germany has been through a very painful process, a very painful public debate, which was characterized by going two steps ahead and then one step backwards. We had this criticism of Germany in January, when there was a perception already that Germany was not doing enough to diffuse the crisis. This has changed in the course of February, and after the immediate invasion, Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, announced this famous Zeitenwende, this change of an era, with increased defense spending, with weapons for Ukraine. But quickly afterwards, it seemed to many that this was basically more of a communication stunt rather than filled with substance. And this led for weeks now to a very tiring discussion within Germany on what kind of heavy weapons should be delivered to Ukraine, different arguments put forward by the government why heavy weapons would not be the right choice at the moment, from the poor state of the German army itself that doesn't have those kind of weapons it can deliver, to raising the threat of nuclear war in response to, or in the context of heavy weapon deliveries. It has been a very inward-looking debate. It has been a very inward-looking debate on sometimes even on meta levels of, is pacifism dead? And that's something which was perceived in Kiev as very frustrating, because every day that Germany discussed these issues was a crucial day for Ukraine. And the same is still the case with sanctions. So when it comes to heavy weapon deliveries, finally the German Bundestag and all parties have agreed to supply weapons to Ukraine, heavy weapons to Ukraine. But the other open question is the oil embargo on Russia. So a couple of EU states, or almost the majority of EU states, would support an oil embargo on Russia. And Germany's Minister of the Economy has announced that Germany actually now would be a position to support an oil embargo, because different other supply routes have been found via Poland, for instance. But there has not been a decision yet whether to use this card against Russia. And this is again something which is perceived by other EU member states and also by Washington and Kiev as delaying tactics. Perhaps Germany finally comes to a point where it does what is right, but it is the very last option before Germany has exhausted all the other options. And it does not correspond to the leadership role that Germany was supposed to have as the economic powerhouse in Europe. So Germany will come around on these questions, but it just takes a long time, and for Ukraine, almost too long.
We've seen different kinds of information come out about Russian attitudes towards the war. There are various surveys done in which it seems that Putin has popular support. On the other hand, some people argue that those surveys have various biases. Perhaps Russians aren't willing to admit reservations about the war. I personally know of several Russians who themselves don't know anybody who supports the war. So what do you make of all of this? I mean, why do Russians continue to support the war? Is it merely this issue about like an information campaign? Is the Russian sentiment towards the war as positive as some of these surveys make it out to be?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think what fascinates me most is how sort of the perception in the Russian public has changed also from the beginning of the war, because immediately after the outbreak of the war, it really seemed that this is Putin's war, that this is not Russia's war, because the Russian population was surprised. I mean, they didn't know that this was coming. No one did. So they were not even, the Russian regime did not even put into the effort of mobilizing their own society, because they were convinced, well, once this is going, we will have a quick campaign, a quick victory. And then in the same vein as in Crimea, we will have the public behind us. And only after sort of the propaganda campaign has been launched, within 2 or 3 weeks, public opinion has already changed. And we already saw major support for the war, and only a quarter of the population being a little bit more hesitant in their attitudes. And the more the information space is closing, all the media that was still available, Ekomoskri, Dorscht, YouTube, Twitter. So the more it gets difficult to use VPN tunnels to access independent information, but also at the same time, Russia's war gets more and more cruel and brutal. So for those people who are not 100% supporting the war, but also not sure whether sort of to believe what they might hear from the BBC, at some point it can be difficult to accept that it's actually your own country that is doing these atrocities. So they might find themselves in a situation of a false balance, where they perhaps do not entirely believe Russian propaganda, and I'm speaking about these 20–30% in the middle, but also can't believe that what is reported in Western media is actually true, because it's just too cruel and too brutal to be true. And I think this is sort of the part of the Russian population which somehow, with limited instruments, we should try to reach out to in the future and now. Obviously, we should support those that are fleeing the country, but those who have doubts and who try to somehow navigate the life through this complicated situation, this is the part of the population that we will have to work with in the future.
I want to ask about reparations. So some economists and some Ukrainian government officials have proposed various plans for the future rebuilding of Ukraine. Can you describe some of these options for financing reconstruction, and what are some of the most feasible and promising options?
Yeah, there are different scenarios how reconstruction will take place. I mean, one scenario is certainly support from the European Union. I think this will be the most important part and the most important role that the EU can play when it comes to reconstruction in Ukraine, because financial support is what is easiest for the European Union to do. The political step to actually make Ukraine a member of the European Union is much more difficult. So it's easier to support reconstruction in Ukraine. The other possibility would be obvious, to make Russia pay for the devastation in Ukraine, but that would require a kind of end of the war, which defeats Russia, which is very, very unlikely to imagine that this will take place at some point. But the other scenario, and the US has just moved into this direction with a discussion in the Congress, is that assets from Russian oligarchs and that are seized can be used to help Ukraine. And this is a new development that we see, that these assets can be rededicated. And given that these assets are quite significant, they can play a role in reparations and in the reconstruction of Ukraine.
Thanks. So for my final question, I want to ask you again to speculate. So do you have a prediction about how and when this war will end?
I would hope that this war will reach a state within this year where at least negotiations can take place again, and take place in the context of at least a ceasefire which is not broken all the time. So a situation which is calmed down, where Russia obviously is still occupying some parts, but smaller parts than they are occupying right now, where they have lost some territory, and Ukraine is in a position again where it has a stronger hand in negotiations. If that is to happen this year, I think we would be in a good situation. But obviously the opposite can also be true, that this war continues in the next year and perhaps the year after. And the crucial point there will be to keep up public support for Ukraine. I mean, we see this incredible support for Ukraine worldwide, but will that still be there if the war continues for 1 or 2 years? And we've seen in Syria how quickly Western societies get used to war crimes and atrocities. So this is something which I'm concerned about, because Russia's possibilities to mobilize society and to make it a wartime society are much greater than our possibilities are. Western societies are obviously quickly distracted by many other questions. And to stay focused on this war, to stay focused on Ukraine's side, is perhaps one of the greatest challenge. And in an article of the Time magazine, it was also described as this is one of the challenges that President Zelensky sees, the flagging attention of the world, and that he considers even to be more worrisome than Russian bombs.
Mm-hmm. Liana, thanks so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you.